Okay, so I'm recording now. So I'm going to talk about emergence and progression. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments while talking about this. As I mentioned, emergence and progression are two game design terms, and they're it's the last kind of like big concept that we want to look at uh, as we are learning new game design terms. I'm going to refresh this because the highlight color is a little. I need to fix that. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Um, and so yeah, as we're starting to elaborate and build out our games, make longer levels, and add more complex things, we can start to think about emergence and progression as two different styles of creating systems for gameplay. And So these are, big words, but they'll make sense to you guys who you've played video games before, and you'll recognize these two different styles in games that you've played in the past. So emergence refers to a game that has simple rules with open-ended results. And so you can think of emergence as the game emerges from the rules rather than being, set from the beginning. So progression is sort of the opposite of that. A progressive game is one that has an order of predefined events. It's more similar to a film or a narrative story. So obviously most games combine both of these techniques, but some games have more or less of one or the other. And thinking about these techniques is a good way to understand how game mechanics fit together. So let's talk about emergence a little bit first. Emergence can be seen in a lot of board games. So something like chess or checkers are good examples of emergent style games. Video games that use emergent gameplay are a lot of simulation games like The Sims, sports games, strategy games, anything where there's uh, open-ended results and simple rules. So chess is a very good example of this. There's a set of rules in chess, and every game starts the same way, but chess games always end in different ways, and there's a lot of different ways that it can play out, and it's usually played between two competitors. So the dynamics of chess are very unpredictable, and the rules are what constitutes the game. There's no narrative to chess. There's no story that goes along with chess. The story comes out of each individual gameplay. Here's The Sims. So very different games, but The Sims is similar to chess in that we always start in the same point, and then the gameplay emerges from the set of rules. So in all of these types of games, emergent games, the simple rules create a complex system. So the rules usually interplay with one another, and gameplay is different from previous games. And typically these games are hard to master. So a good emergent game will be fun to play multiple times, and it'll take a long time to get really good at it. Chess obviously is the ultimate example of this, where people can play chess their whole lives and learn more and more as they play. Um, Emergent games are the ones that are going to tend to, have an audience. So like games where you might have people streaming on Twitch, or you might go to a competitive example of that game. Those are probably emergent games. In creating an emergent game, we spend less time on, designing the art and creating the arc of the story, the progression of the narrative. We spend most of the time on the rules of the game and making small tweaks to the structure of the rules to see how it changes the overall gameplay. Games of emergence also will typically have a strategy guide rather than a walkthrough. So there's no walkthrough for a game like chess because it's not going to happen the same way every time. There's a strategy guide that explains the rules and gives you strategies about how to use the rules to play the game well. So here's an example of the Pokemon strategy guide. This is a good example of an emergent game that has some progressive qualities. Typically, a playthrough of an emergent game is going to be short. This is a little bit subjective. Like a game of chess usually is not going to be more than like an hour, but it could be. There are exceptions to this. Simulation games like Civilization could last for a very long time. And as I mentioned, emergent games are more likely to have an audience. Esports types games are usually emergent games. Here's the Overwatch finals. So this is an example of an emergent game where you have competitors. They may play multiple rounds of the same game, but the game rules are always going to be the same, and the gameplay emerges out of those rules. So within emergent games, the goals are formed by the individual players rather than being set by the designers. So in a game of most emergent games have like a win state, but how you get to that win state is different depending on your strategy. And so the goals of your particular approach may be different. You may have different ways of getting to the ultimate end. In emergent games, the gameplay is usually much more interesting than just the basic rules. Describing the rules of chess isn't that interesting, but watching a chess game unfold can be very interesting. So as I mentioned, game designers create a winning condition or multiple winning conditions to account for what's likely to happen over the course of a game. For example, in Monopoly, it's likely that some players will accumulate money and other players will go bankrupt or losing all their money. So the ultimate win state for Monopoly is that one person has all of the money. But the goals and strategies to get there can be different depending on the player. In terms of challenges, computer-based emergent systems often include ways for handicapping the leader or winning player. So this is a form of feedback, and it could be positive or negative depending on the way that it's designed. So an example of this that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with is the idea of rubber banding. This is an example of negative feedback. So it is hindering players who are doing well. And this is something that we usually avoid as game designers. But in an emergent game, this could be an advantage because if one player is much better than the other players, then we might need to add in a rubber banding to make sure that the game is still competitive. So in Mario Kart, one of the ways that they achieve this is that the weapons that you gain as you play the game typically shoot forward. And so you can shoot the cars that are ahead of you. But you can also see the effects of the speed of the cars changing to kind of adjust for the play style of the player. This is an example of a Mario Kart track with the speed shown of the different cars. And it's color coded. You can see the speed changes depending on their position in the race. So players that are farther ahead, their maximum speed is actually clamped a little bit so that the game doesn't become completely uncompetitive. So this is kind of an interesting example of negative feedback. The better you play the game, the worse the sort of computer system will treat you. In emergent games, the challenge is built around interactions with other players. So you almost always have to have other players in an emergent game. You could be playing against the computer, but they would be an AI or something like that that could imitate human behavior. So there are desirable and undesirable effects from emergent gameplay. So when we're creating an emergent game, we kind of have to study what we want to happen versus what players might be able to figure out how to do. So one of the things we have to make sure is that players can't exploit certain rules or certain glitches within the system to win the game in a way that we haven't intended. So we can kind of think about what a good player might be able to do to win the game and then try to structure the game to lead to that result. In an emergent game, rewards can be internal economies and social rewards outside of the game. So things like leaderboards, things like points that you can transfer to another game or to some other system that the game is connected to. A Fortnite skin is a good example of this. This is the type of reward for playing well or for other things that doesn't actually change the gameplay, but it has this external social value. Okay, so moving over to progression. So Again, these concepts almost always are combined within a game. Um, Most games use a little bit of both of these, if not, if they might lean towards one or the other. But most games have both of these strategies involved. So progressive games, uh, good examples of progressive games are things like Super Mario or King's Quest. And you can see this screenshot or this image is all of the different levels of King's Quest in a grid. And so you can see that everything is predetermined. There's a progressive narrative. So even though it's interactive and we can move between the different screens in a new way each time we play the game, there's still basically a set of different screens that we have to move through to complete the game and to complete the narrative. So in progressive games, there are levels or stages that the player progresses through, and usually there's a fictional world that the game is based in, and that's enhanced by progression. Narrative in this in games is usually expressed spatially, so you move from one level to another or one world to another, and that advances the story rather than temporally, although both can exist. This is an example of Undertale, which is an RPG style game. And we can watch a little bit of this game to get a sense of what a progressive game looks like. So we can see a progressive game will usually have a narrative. So it's going to start with either text or a performer reading a story. That's going to set up sort of the framing for the game. And then the progression through the game is kind of an exploration of that narrative. I assume a lot of you guys have probably played Undertale, but if not, I recommend it. It's a really good RPG style game. Also using pixel graphics. So if a game has cutscenes with narrative, that is probably a progressive style game. Progressive games tend to be reliant on video game platform distribution because they require a lot of assets. So if you make a game that has 20 or 40 or 60 hours of gameplay, usually those game files are going to be really large. You need a lot of people to work on them, and you need a distribution system to distribute them to players. And walkthroughs are going to typically be associated with progressive games. So a lot of time you'll find walkthroughs online that take you through each part of the game. They might explain, how to defeat the various challenges, or they might just show you the basic narrative. Last of Us is a good example of a progressive game. It has lots of narrative. Okay. What? I think so. I think I watched it on Twitch. Yeah. Oh, really? What? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Um, Yes, but still a good example of a progressive game. So there's a narrative, and there's a fictional world that we're invested in. So progressive games are typically single player. You can play multiplayer, especially more with games more recently with online networking and stuff. The gameplay is usually going to be longer, but you also only play it once. Usually, you might play it. You might play a big game like Last of Us once. You may come back a few years later and play through it again, but you're not going to play it every single day like you would a game of chess. Typically, these games are easier to learn. They're more about the narrative, and they rely more on gaming convention. So most platformers use the same basic, keyboard inputs or gamepad inputs. So the player doesn't have to learn the rules. They can just start playing and progress through the game. So we're going to end up in most games, we're going to end up combining both of these concepts. Progression can be used as a way to introduce game systems in an emergent game. So most emergent games will have some sort of tutorial that uses progression. It progresses from one sort of rule to the next, or one game mechanic to the next. And then progress is often used as a resource for emergent games. So, for example, if you're playing a game that keeps track of your level, something like Rocket League or other competitive games, the more you play the game, the higher level you'll get, and then you can play against other players that have the same level, so you can get to advanced parts of the game. So that is sort of a progressive game mechanic that's used in a mostly emergent game. So games should be designed so that the characters have freedom, but is likely to encounter story through progression or regular gameplay. So in a game, we kind of have to lead the character to a certain part of the game. We want to have balance between progressive and emergent elements so that the player doesn't get bored just reading narrative or just watching cutscenes, but they also learn the game mechanics and figure out, get good at the game as they progress. So a few resources here to read more about progression and emergence. This is a very good article by a game design writer, Jesper Jewell, and he has a lot of great articles on his website talking about various terms. And this is a really good one with a lot of good examples of how these concepts influence game design. Another article that is archived, so it may take a second to load. Let's come back. And this one is just a PDF. Sorry, okay, why are you telling me this? I don't care. Go away. Okay. I zoom in on this. This is just another academic study about integrating emergence and progression that has a lot of good examples and kind of talks about how to use these approaches and how they affect gameplay again. So that's another good article to check out. And then this old RPG Maker article that just kind of describes these terms in more detail. So there's a few resources there to check out. So that's emergence and progression. We're going to go back to the schedule. I'm going to stop this recording.